$100 million, which is a fairly moderate cap and below what's currently being spent. It also lowers the reimbursement to insurance companies to the President's target of 12% return from 14% return.
Is the balance of his time?
Reserve the balance.
Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Mr. Chairman, I yield to the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Crawford, 1 minute.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the chairman. Farm policy is intended to provide support when needed based on production. U.S. farms have been forced to become larger to increase efficiency and remain competitive in the global marketplace. Arbitrarily limiting policies ultimately limits the ability of farms to grow and gain efficiencies, thereby penalizing U.S. farmers and putting them at a distinct disadvantage to our global competitors. Adjusted gross income is different than farm profit. There are a number of expenses that must be covered. In addition to personal expenses, farmers must service debt. Given the cost of today's machinery and land can easily reach into the millions. AGI rules penalize spouses who oftentimes take off-farm jobs to help make ends meet when farmers are struggling with their farm income. An unreasonable AGI means test creates uncertainty for growers and their lenders by creating a ping-pong effect of being eligible one year and ineligible the next, making it difficult or impossible for lenders to measure with any certainty the future cash flow of thousands of farm and ranch families in order to make both short and long-term lending decisions. In short, an unreasonable AGI means test would make U.S. farm policy unpredictable, inequitable, and punitive for thousands of American farm ranch families.
Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, how much time do I have?
4 minutes.
4 minutes. Mr. Chairman, at this time I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Connecticut, Ms. Delora, champion for family farmers and for the nutrition program in the Farm Bill.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. I rise in support of this amendment, strong support of this amendment, because it aims to reform a broken crop insurance program. This is a program where taxpayers foot an average of 60% of the premiums for beneficiaries, plus there's the reimbursement of the administrative and operating costs, 100% of those efforts. These are for private companies that sell the plants, including multinational corporations, some of whom trace back to companies who are in tax havens. And essentially what it does, it works to improve crop insurance. It limits taxpayers' subsidized profits of companies that sell crop insurance. It does not harm the ability of the companies to sell these policies in any way. It would ensure that taxpayers do not continue to subsidize these administrative and operating expenses. It's a bipartisan amendment. It enjoys broad support from a number of groups across the political spectrum, as has been laid out. It caps the amount of crop insurance premium support individual producers receive. GAO said that the cap would have affected just under 4%. It would shine. Thank you. Crop insurance is the only farm support program subsidized by taxpayers and not subject to a payment limitation. This would bring this in line with other farm programs, and it would shine a little long overdue sunlight to the crop insurance program. And yield back.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Barrow.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Chairman, I thank the gentleman for the time. I rise in opposition to the amendment. The people I represent value American agriculture and understand that food doesn't grow on grocery store shelves. It takes the hard work and high risk of farmers to get that food to market. I believe all of those farmers are worth supporting. This amendment will undermine the safety net for many of those farmers, large and small. Many people don't realize it, but farm operations are made up of as many different kinds of farms as people. Different farms have different sizes, different ownership structures, different crop mixes, and different equipment. And that diversity makes our domestic farming portfolio strong. It's often the big guys who act as the hub of a farm community and offer the smaller farmers in the area access to expensive equipment that they could never afford on their own. These are all family farms in the best sense of the word, and they depend on each other for their livelihood. This amendment effectively ends the safety net for the large family farmer, without whom many of our small family farms couldn't produce. I therefore urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Oklahoma reserve?
Gentleman reserves.
Gentleman reserves.
Mr. Chairman, what's the balance of time?
2 3/4 minutes.
And the gentleman from Oklahoma?
6.5 minutes.
I'd like to reserve, Mr. Chairman, I would yield.
Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Mr. Chairman, I would yield to the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, 1 minute.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your yielding also to me. And I rise in opposition to the Kind Amendment, and I do so because I don't want to see agriculture distorted. We've watched as equipment's gotten larger, farms have gotten larger, and when you start locking this thing down and tying it to an AGI, what you really have is a means test for the first time. It pits neighbors against neighbors. Here's what I remember. Back in the 80s, when we had a farm crisis and we had a real disaster, I saw on the front page of the paper come out $26 billion in farm subsidy, disaster money to deal with drought and the climate that we had and the bad economic climate. We haven't had those calls. 2011, we had a big flood. No calls for disaster money. 2012, we had a big drought. No calls for disaster money. Crop insurance is working. 86% of the crop is insured today. I recall it being 13% back then when I saw the $26 billion bill hit the headlines in the Des Moines Register. So I urge opposition to the Kind Amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Mr. Chairman, I wish to yield 2 minutes to the ranking member of the House Ag Committee, Mr. Peters.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for yielding. You know, what this amendment is going to do is undermine the crop insurance system and take a whole bunch of people out of the crop insurance system that we need to make it actuarially sound. Now, it was just said here that there's no other program that doesn't have a payment limit. Well, let me tell you something. Mr. Kind is co-sponsor of the Goodlatte-Scott dairy provision, which has no payment limit. And the 6,000 cow dairies in Mr. Kind's district are going to get $600,000 of benefit from our subsidies in the dairy program, and there's no payment limitation. So come on. You know, if you really believe in payment limits, why isn't it on the Goodlatte-Scott scheme? You know? So, I mean, this amendment undermines everything that we've been trying to do in the Agriculture Committee. We had the biggest disaster last year, drought, that we've ever had. We had no significant call for an ad hoc disaster for the first time that I can remember since I've been here. And the reason is because crop insurance worked. You know, agriculture is working. In my district, you know, we have 3% unemployment because agriculture is working. You know, the one part of the economy that's actually working, and all these people that want to create jobs and want to create government programs so we create jobs, they want to take the one thing that's working in the country and screw it up. And I'm not going to be part of it. So vote no on this amendment.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Mr. Chairman, how much time do I have left?
Gentleman has 2 3/4, and the gentleman from Wisconsin has 2 3/4.
I yield to myself, Mr. Chairman, 2 minutes.
Gentleman's recognized.
The ranking member makes very valid points. When you look at the way federal crop insurance works, it shifts the risk from the Treasury to the private companies, to the reinsurers, to the farmers and ranchers. If you look at how these premiums and payments have gone over the last decade, not just the really tough weather last year, you'll find that in reality 70% of the policies over the last 10 years have not returned one single penny. 70%. And if you look at how the program has worked in the 7 years prior to the onset of the drought of 2011, basically the federal government actually made money on federal crop insurance. Now, I can't help the anomaly that the super drought was in the Midwest, but I can tell you that's a pretty good track record. The ranking member is entirely right. It works. Let's not mess up something that works. With that, I reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself such time as might consume in response. And to my good friend in Minnesota, my average dairy herd size in western Wisconsin is 125 cows. I don't have the mega dairy operations in that, so we'll have plenty of time to debate the supply management, federal-run supply management program that he's been advocating within the Farm Bill, which I think will be a disaster and won't work. But to my friend from Iowa, we're not talking about eliminating the crop insurance program. This risk management tool will be in place. It won't touch 96% of the producers out there. But the last time I checked, we're running some record budget deficits, and there are areas in this farm program, especially in crop insurance, that we can go to for sensible, common-sense savings that's economically justifiable while maintaining risk within the program today. And it's a little ironic that we have such defenders of this crop insurance program when last year alone the typical insurance company received $1.46 in taxpayer subsidies to every dollar that went into the pocket of our farmers. And 5 of the 10 biggest insurance companies offering these programs are foreign-owned entities. And as the gentlelady from Connecticut just pointed out, many of them are using tax havens on the taxpayer dime. And how they can get up here and justify this program with a straight face is really beyond me. And with that, I'd reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Mr. Chairman, I yield the remainder of my time to the gentleman from Illinois.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to my colleague, Chairman Lucas. Thank you to Ranking Member Peterson. We agree. Crop insurance is not broken. And I stand here today to remind my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that recently the Secretary of Ag, Tom Vilsack, sat in our Ag Committee hearing and said crop insurance is not broken. Crop insurance is one of the most successful programs we have in the Midwest, as you heard in this debate. We see that we're not doing off-budget disaster assistance. We see that farmers are willing to give up direct payments to have better risk management tools like crop insurance. Let's also get to the point, too, that bankers, our creditors, will not give loans to our farmers and keep our family farms in business without a strong risk management program like an effective crop insurance program that we have. I urge all of my colleagues to oppose this amendment. We need to ensure that this risk management tool, crop insurance, stays as viable and as effective as it is. And I stand here today and agree with Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack and agree that crop insurance is not broken. Please oppose this amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Wisconsin.
Chairman, how much time do I have remaining?
1.5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, at this time I'd like to yield to my good friend, the gentlelady from Maine, 1 minute, Ms. Pingree.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Kind, for giving up some of your valuable time, and I will try to be quick. First, I want to thank the Chair and the Ranking Member. They've worked hard on the Farm Bill, and I appreciate many of the good pieces that are in this bill. But there are a lot of unconscionable cuts that eat deeply into the working poor in this country, particularly the SNAP benefits cut. SNAP benefits, which is a means-tested program, and I want to rise in support of this amendment. Because unlike the cuts to the SNAP benefits for low-income families, this amendment just asks the richest agricultural business in America to pay a little more and receive a little less. Just this one portion of the amendment, the $250,000 cap for farmers that clear more than $250,000 a year. We have a lot of farmers in our state and a growing number of farmers in our state, but there are very few that clear more money than that. This mostly affects corporate farms. 96% of the farmers will never be affected by this amendment, but for a very few, this is a huge benefit. I yield my colleagues to support this amendment, and I thank my colleague for his time.
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman from Wisconsin.
I believe the chairman has the right to close. Yes.
Gentleman has the right to close and does still have time.
No. Mr. Chairman, let me close by saying that, listen, I understand there's a lot of hard work that goes into the committee in producing a farm bill. Now, I get that. But there are areas of cost savings that we can justify to the American taxpayer without jeopardizing the risk management tools. Crop insurance is ripe for that type of reform. And again, what we're offering and what we're sending out is very common sense, economically justifiable, and would save the American taxpayer over $11 billion over the next 10 years. And if the average taxpayer knew just how this crop insurance program is set up today, they'd be aghast in horror. It's not right. And we're trying to correct that right now by maintaining the safety net and a viable crop insurance program that can work. I encourage my colleagues to support the amendment.
Time has expired. Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Yield myself whatever time I may have yet. I would just simply say to my colleagues, the system works. As my colleague also noted, it is critically important to farmers be able to secure their financing. And while ultimately, like most provisions of the Farm Bill that raise the food and fiber, the consumers at the end of the chain benefit from the highest quality, most affordable priced food and fiber in the history of the world. Please protect this important resource to production agriculture. Please continue to enable farmers to farm. Vote no on this amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Wisconsin. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, on that, I request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Wisconsin will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 48, printed in Part B of House Report 113-117. For what purpose is the gentleman from Delaware seeking recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Part B, Amendment Number 48, printed in House Report Number 113-117, offered by Mr. Carney of Delaware.
Pursuant to House Resolution 271, the gentleman from Delaware, Mr. Carney, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The gentleman from Delaware is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of a bipartisan, straightforward amendment that I introduced with my colleague, Congressman Riddell of Florida, that will help maximize the efficiency of taxpayer dollars used in federal crop insurance programs. Periodically, the USDA, through the Risk Management Agency, renegotiates its agreement with private crop insurers for the delivery and administration of the federal crop insurance. These negotiations, known as standard reinsurance agreements, do not affect the premium subsidies paid to farmers and instead focus on the percent of gains or losses assumed by taxpayers and the level of crop insurance administrative and operating costs paid by the federal government. The most recent negotiation was finalized in 2010 and yielded $6 billion in savings. Of these savings, $4 billion was used to reduce the federal deficit, and the remaining $2 billion was put back into farm programs to supplement conservation efforts and improve certain products provided through the federal crop insurance program. Our amendment simply maintains the current law by striking a provision in the bill requiring that any savings from future standard reinsurance agreements be put back into the federal crop insurance program. This amendment continues to respect the importance of a robust farm safety net while maintaining USDA's tools to improve federal crop insurance, reduce the deficit, and strengthen conservation programs within the Farm Bill. Our amendment is supported by taxpayer advocates as well as the environmental community who share the same goal of ensuring that the federal crop insurance program works for farmers and for taxpayers. I want to thank my colleague from Florida for working with me on this amendment, and I urge its support. Thank you for consideration. I yield to the gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Chair, I rise in support of this amendment.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of this amendment because I believe that American taxpayers should be considered when their money is basically being divvied up here in Washington. That's what we're deciding. This amendment, which I thank the gentleman from Delaware for offering with me, simply allows savings to occur in a renegotiation of crop insurance agreements. I love the fact that we're working on both sides of the aisle. This is as bipartisan as you can get, Mr. Chair. And oftentimes on our side, as fiscal conservatives, we are accused of cut, cut, cut. But what this is really about is save, save, save. The members of this House should be encouraging this administration to save, save, save when we can. This amendment allows for the USDA to attempt to find savings when negotiating. So let's not tie the hands of our negotiators, as this current bill does. Let's allow them to pursue savings on behalf of the hardworking American taxpayer working day in and day out right now. All around the country, people are struggling to get by. So instead of requiring the maximum amount of taxpayer dollars to be spent on this government program, all we're asking is let's just try and save some money with this. And that's what this amendment does. So a vote for this amendment is a vote to keep the taxpayer, the hardworking American taxpayer, in mind. What is fair for them when we set up this crop insurance policy? It's plain, it's simple. I encourage my colleagues to vote yes on this amendment. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman.
Mr. Chairman, how much time do I have?
1.5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I would just like to close by thanking the gentleman from Florida for his assistance on this amendment. and just to ask my colleagues to think about what we've been trying to do since I came to this House in 2011, which is to get a budget balance and to find savings wherever we can. This is an opportunity to use savings from the renegotiations of these agreements for deficit reduction and other things that the USDA might seem appropriate. So I want to thank my colleague for that and yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields purpose is the gentleman from Texas.
Same time in opposition.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, first off, a couple of points. One, the 40-some-odd hearings we had on the last couple of years, at every single one of them, whether it involved crop insurance or not, the producers said, don't screw up crop insurance. Crop insurance is a one risk management tool that we know works. It's the one our bankers understand the best, and don't screw that up. A little history lesson. 2008 Farm Bill cut $6 billion out of the crop insurance program and out of the hides of the folks that these folks have been talking about. A re-rating process that USDA went through and RMA went through cut an additional $3 billion. And then the standard insurance agreement renegotiation that Congress had nothing to do with trimmed another $8 billion out. So $17 billion has been reduced out of the crop insurance program since the last time we authorized this. Nothing in the base bill stops the Department of USDA from finding savings in the crop insurance program. Nothing. They are still able to do that. What we would like to happen with those savings, though, is we'd like for Congress to control those. We don't want the pet projects of the administration, the pet projects of USDA to get funded. Now, my colleagues threw the words deficit reduction around in good faith, but that's not what happens with this money. USDA and the administration finds other places to spend the money. We don't think that's the right idea. So I understand the intent of this, but there's nothing in the base bill that restricts USDA from finding those savings if they can find them. We just want Congress to control how that money gets spent, and not the pet projects that the administration does. So I urge a no vote on this. I believe it was done in good faith, but it won't accomplish what they want. It simply further empowers this executive branch and the administration to do what they will with these savings. So the savings are still going to be there, still going to be able to find them, and so I urge a no vote on this, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Delaware. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Delaware will be postponed. It's now in order to consider amendment number 49, printed in Part B of House Report 113-117. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Part B, amendment number 49, printed in House Report number 113-117, offered by Mr. Radel of Florida.
Pursuant to House Resolution 271, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Radel, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've only been here a few months. In my short time, I've witnessed firsthand just how we spend your money here in Washington. Your money, the hardworking, tax-paying American. Even I was shocked, though, to learn about something that is hidden very, very deep in this year's Farm Bill. It's actually filed under miscellaneous. It is for sheep shearing. Sheep shearing. Sheep shearing. We have already spent $50 million on sheep shearing, an industry that's, well, basically goes back to the Old Testament. Moses was sheep shearing. So my amendment, right here, one page, one sentence, will stop another $50 million from being wasted. But let's take a look at what $50 million of your money has purchased you as a hardworking, tax-paying American. This program funded a trip to Australia for the Tri-Lambs. It's kind of a play off of Revenge of the Nerds, if anyone saw that movie in the 80s. Look, as much as I love that flick, the purpose of this trip was to get people to eat lamb and Mr. Chair, I'm sorry, but I think that we can find a better way to use our money here in the United States. In another grant, 2 beginner sheep shearers were given, here we go, free combs, brushes, razors, and scissors. With our $50 million, what we're talking about here are startup costs. Think about that. If you are a business owner and you had $50 million, what you could do with that kind of money. It was startup money, and here again in Washington, where the people of the United States of America are so sick and tired of us picking and choosing who will succeed or who will lose. That's debatable right now when we look at this. It's not fair. You're struggling to make ends meet. We have Democrats right now and Republicans who are debating our social safety net in this country right now about how hungry children are, and we're talking about $50 million to shave sheep. It would be laughable if it was not so sad. This could be your money that you could be saving up for your rent, for your mortgage, for your next vacation. This is as bipartisan as you can get. We are looking for places to save and show how we here in Congress can be more efficient with your money, accountable and transparent with your money. You who are working 40, 50, 60 hours a week. With that, Mr. Chair, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. What purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
I claim time in opposition.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I started to be down one path, but the disdain with which my good colleague from Florida insulted the folks in this industry is unacceptable. I rise in opposition. I wish he would get his facts correct. The total appropriation, actual money spent since '96, is $1 million. He's confused authorizations with appropriations. And so if he'll go check his records, the $50 million he blasted out over and over and over was just simply incorrect. That has not been money that's spent. Sheep shearing is an important issue with respect to growing and the wool industry in this country. It is about jobs. Sheep shearing is hard work, and we're trying to figure out ways to make that happen. This board is housed at the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Agriculture Marketing Service. It's a board appointed by the Secretary of Agriculture. It's composed of 7 members, 4 active sheep growers, 2 finance and management members, and then 2 folks out of the USDA to make a total of 9. The National Sheep Industry Improvement Center provides small grants projects to assist in the improvement of the sheep industry and the expansion of markets. Throughout the Farm Bill, we have attempted over and over and over again to promote production agriculture and the jobs associated with it. And while sheep shearing may not be particularly exotic, and from folks from Florida may be beneath them, the folks in West Texas take a whole different view of that. The author of the amendment has disparaged these grants, saying that they're for razors and combs for beginning shearers. That's how you do it, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman. And the truth is there's a shortage of properly trained wool harvesting professionals. This shortage is critical and one of the difficulties for producers who wish to participate in the production of wool. A major barrier for beginning sheep shearing professionals is the initial cost of purchasing the equipment. These small grants assist to create these jobs in an industry that needs our help. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Chair, we're defending sheep shearing. $50 million in appropriations, $1 million under government accounting, with giant quotes around that. When we look at the industry, quote-unquote, best practices, again, those quotes dripping with practically sarcasm, they could have been written by Moses with how old this industry is. The proposal funds, quote, an informational video describing recommended goat handling practices. And when we look at the positions in this, the 9, 7 are from the industry itself, 2 are from the federal government. They're using this money on social media. Mr. Chair, you know as well as I do, we're talking, this is free. Social media, the internet. This doesn't cost money to, quote, create a buzz among consumers. These are their quotes about lamb. I love lamb. Sure, I'll go out, I'll have dinner with lamb any night. But I don't think that the federal government needs to fund a PR campaign for one industry. Again, this is why the American people are so frustrated with both Democrats and Republicans picking and choosing industries. Congress has wasted $50 million, yes, in appropriations since 1996 on this program. It is time that this House, elected to save taxpayer dollars in a time where we have record deficits, runaway spending, put our votes where the Americans, the hardworking taxpaying Americans' money is. I encourage my colleagues to vote for this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Texas.
Again, Mr. Chairman, it's $1 million since 1996, not 50. He's exaggerating again. And with that, I yield 2 minutes to the ranking member of the committee, Mr. Peterson.
Thank the gentleman for yielding, and I too rise in opposition to this amendment. And I would reiterate what my good friend Mr. Conaway said, and that we did not spend $50 million. We spent $1 million. And I was part of putting this in the 2008 Farm Bill. And the reason is that we almost killed off the sheep and goat industry in this country. With what we did back in the 90s and so forth, there was hardly anybody left in the industry. And we were basically gave it away to New Zealand and Australia. And what we're trying to do, and what we tried to do in the 2008 bill for this little bit amount of money that we put in there, was give this industry a chance to get back on its feet and start producing lamb products and goat products in this country instead of importing them from some other place. That's what this is all about. And, you know, you can make fun of it all you want, but at the end of the day, this is about American jobs and about keeping the production here in the United States. So, you know, let's be clear about what this is. It's $1 million. I think it's money that's well spent. And we can go into all of the reason for the demise of the sheep industry. A lot of it had to do with what we did at the federal level, at the government level, to screw this industry up, especially in Montana, Wyoming, places like that. But we don't have time to go into all of that. So this is a modest effort to help that industry get back on its feet and make sure that those jobs are in the U.S.
Gentleman from...
Mr. Chair, only in Washington, D.C. can someone call $1 million a modest amount. There's one thing that I live by, that I hope that I can serve the American people with, and it is that the individual raindrop does not blame itself for the flood. Mr. Speaker, we are in a time of record deficits, a debt that hangs over to the point that it is a national security problem for our country. I encourage my colleagues to vote for this amendment and slow the torrent of wasteful spending. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas.
I would reiterate my opposition, this is a good investment, and I would yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. The opinion chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida will be postponed. But I don't.
Hard labor. But I've had to start it.
It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 50. Amendment Number 50, printed in Part B of House Report 113-117. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Part B, Amendment Number 50, printed in House Report Number 113-117, offered by Mr. Wahlberg of Michigan.
Pursuant to House Resolution 271, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
weren't for the lateness of the hour, I'd be tempted to ask if any of my colleagues have had constituents call or write their offices to ask whether Congress has lost its marbles. I won't do that. But I would point out the fact that the underlying bill that we're considering tonight contains a provision to create a checkoff program, like many others, but this is a checkoff program for natural stone on behalf of the marble and granite industry. But to those of my friends who are supporters of the checkoff program, and again there are many checkoff programs, I would simply ask for you to take a close look at my amendment. Proponents of this checkoff have argued that stone is a natural product, and yes, it is. But is it just like the other products covered in the checkoff program in the agriculture arena? To anyone unfamiliar, here's a sampling of some of the other checkoff programs currently run by the USDA. Dairy, eggs, beef, blueberries, pork, sorghum, watermelons, etc. The common denominator between the some 20 checkoff programs run by the USDA is that they are all agricultural commodities. They all grow. They all can be raised. The statutory authority for this program defines precisely what an acceptable agricultural commodity is, and rock, no matter how natural it is not one of them. Mr. Speaker, farmers in my district do not grow rocks. In fact, they don't like it when frost heaves and pushes new rocks up in their fields, as in my farm field. My amendment is more than fair, Mr. Chairman, and necessary to maintaining the integrity of the Farm Bill, and not expanding, as our chairman earlier this evening expressed concern about expanding more Farm Bill programs in assorted prior amendments. There are no laws preventing this industry from imposing a voluntary tax on their membership. If they are really insistent on having a government-run checkoff, they could have pursued a program under a more appropriate agency like the Department of Commerce or the Department of Interior. I would hope my colleagues, Mr. Chairman, would agree that rocks have no place in a farm bill and would join me in removing this provision from the bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Does the gentleman from Georgia rise?
Mr. Speaker, I rise to speak in opposition of the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yeah. I rise in opposition to this amendment, and the underlying language of the Farm Bill simply provides this industry the same opportunity that many other industries have been provided through the checkoff. I share a similar concern with the gentleman that has the amendment, that Commerce or Interior might have been an appropriate place to put this, other than they simply don't have the infrastructure to handle such a program. The infrastructure is already there in the USDA. There are other examples of products outside of agriculture that have been handled there, and it simply gives the industry an opportunity, the U.S. stone industry, the opportunity to come together with a voluntary payment to support a marketing program to help their industry. Again, it is voluntary. A tax, by definition, is an involuntary payment to support the government. This is a voluntary payment to support an industry, and with that I reserve the remainder of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Michigan.
Well, I would suggest that it's not voluntary for all of those in an industry, and I'm certain that not all of them in the industry are asking for this checkoff. But again, understand there may not be the best infrastructure like the agriculture USDA programs for a checkoff like this, but again, I would ask the sponsor of this proposal, when have we grown rocks? Do we seed rocks? When we look at the agricultural commodity as a term described and defined, It says the agricultural commodity means agricultural, horticultural, verticultural, and dairy products, livestock and the products of livestock, the products of poultry and bee raising, the products of forestry. And I could go on, but it nowhere says rocks. And again, to expand the program in a farm bill issue, dealing with something we can't grow, I think establishes a wrong precedent. I ask for support for the amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The Chair would remind members to address the Chair rather than other members in the body. With that, we'll recognize the gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I've got great respect for the author of the amendment, and he knows that. But I do stand in opposition to the amendment. The checkoff programs in the generic basis are very successful. The industry itself votes on them and comes together to decide how that they're used for generic promotion of the products. And so I respectfully disagree with my good colleague, who he knows I respect, but I have to oppose this amendment. We handled this in the committee, and it passed in committee. It gave it a good scrubbing there. So I would ask my colleagues to oppose the amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Georgia. The gentleman from Georgia.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Michigan.
Mr. Chairman, could I request the amount of time I have?
Gentleman has 1 minute, while the gentleman from Georgia has 3.5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the respect, and I understand that. I appreciate the fact that USDA has a good record of dealing with checkoffs. I'm not necessarily opposed to all checkoffs, but they ought to fit. And growing rocks, marble, granite, it just does not fit in an agricultural program. I think that's apparent. And so I'd ask my colleagues, Mr. Chairman, to support this amendment again to keep the integrity of the Farm Bill in growing agriculture. I reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Georgia.
Again, Mr. Speaker, I would be happy to put it in the Department of Commerce or Interior, but the infrastructure is already there to put it in the USDA, and with that, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Alabama.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the chairman. Chairman, I have had several small businesses in Alabama, marble businesses, granite business, stone businesses, that have contacted me and told me that this discretionary permission to request a research order or promotion is very important to them. They've been struggling the past several years since our what was almost a depression, and to do anything, I think, that would hinder their recovery. And they're small businesses. They hire, you know, I'm talking about businesses of 10 people, 30 people, 100 people, and this is predominantly a small business venture. And we all have them in our communities, and I would urge a no vote, although I do respect the gentleman from Michigan and many of his endeavors. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Georgia.
I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves. Gentleman from Michigan.
Mr. Chairman, propane and oil heat function as checkoff programs under the Department of Commerce and the Department of Energy. The statutory authority for the USDA checkoff also does not include rock. And so I respectfully request that my colleagues in this body support this amendment that keeps free from those things that don't grow and are part of agriculture out of the Farm Bill, and I yield my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker, the industry has simply asked for a chance to participate in a no-cost to the taxpayer voluntary program where they can use that to help promote their product. I, as a conservative, think that this is good for some of our small business owners, and I respectfully ask that we oppose that amendment. And with that said, I'm ready to close if the gentleman is.
Gentleman has yielded back.
Yes.
Does the gentleman from Georgia yield back?
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Michigan. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Request the record.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Michigan will be postponed.
Great.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Oklahoma seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, with great pleasure, pursuant to Section 3 of House Resolution 271, I offer the following amendments in block, which I have placed at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendments in block.
On block number 1, consisting of amendments numbered 53, 59, 60, 62 through 97, and 103, printed in Part B of House Report number 113-117, offered by Mr. Lucas of Oklahoma.
Pursuant to House Resolution 271, the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Lucas, and the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Peterson, will each control 10 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Oklahoma.
Mr. Chairman, I claim half that time, of course, and yield 1 minute to Mr. Barr.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Part of the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of an amendment to ensure certainty and advance notice of any changes to crop insurance eligibility for our family farmers. On December 18, 2012, the RMA made a decision to alter the 2013 provisions of insurance for flue-cured and burley tobacco to impose a more stringent rotation schedule on tobacco farmers. Starting this year, farms have to rotate land every 2 years to qualify for crop insurance coverage. Farmers had already made their preparations for spring planting at the time of this untimely announcement, and there was no public involvement or formal rulemaking process. Many farmers had already purchased fertilizer, signed leases, and made other business decisions under the impression that the land they were making preparations for would be covered under the previous requirements. Had these farmers been made aware in advance of these changes that rendered many ineligible for crop insurance coverage, they would have had sufficient time to make alternative plans. This amendment would prevent this problem by happening to any commodity moving forward. The amendment is very simple.
Mr. Chairman, I yield the gentleman 1 more minute.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is very simple. It would not overturn any existing crop insurance requirements, but it would simply give our family farmers, including those in Kentucky, particularly burley tobacco growers, the time they need to adjust to future changes in crop insurance requirements. It would require that any changes to current crop insurance policies be published and open for public comment at least 60 days before June 30th and at least 60 days before November 30th of the preceding year. These dates are the self-imposed deadlines the Risk Management Agency sets each year to announce any changes to existing policies for the ensuing crop season. I encourage my colleagues to support the amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Gentleman from Minnesota reserves. Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Mr. Chairman, I yield to the gentleman from Texas, Subcommittee Chairman Conaway, 2 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, thank you for including this amendment in the en bloc section. Mr. Speaker, I rise to introduce or to support an amendment that would require the Secretary of State to submit a report on water sharing with Mexico as defined by the 1944 Water Treaty. This amendment has bipartisan support, and I'd like to thank my good colleague Filemon Villa from Texas for supporting this important legislation. This amendment addresses Mexico's failure to uphold its water obligations to the United States by seeking to increase accountability in water management by requiring the State Department to provide regular reports to Congress outlining the management of the Rio Grande system. The Rio Grande plays an important role in meeting the water needs of businesses and families all across West and South Texas. This is a result of a 1944 water treaty between the United States and Mexico, which outlines the obligations of both parties in the lower Rio Grande. Both the U.S. and Mexico are obligated to jointly manage and derive benefit from the water resources located across the binational border. Mexico is required to provide 350,000 acre-feet of water on average each year over a 5-year term. Currently, Mexico has failed to meet this obligation as they owe nearly 500,000 acre-feet to the United States. It's not a secret that Texas has suffered a terrible drought, and there is really no relief in sight. Mexico needs to begin fulfilling its obligations. Our farming and ranching communities depend on it. And again, I appreciate the Chairman for including it in the en bloc amendment and obviously support passage of the en bloc amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Oklahoma.
If I can inquire of my colleague, the ranking member, I don't have any additional
Well,
speakers.
I've got, if I could claim a minute of my time.
Gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for 1 minute.
I'd like to inquire of the chairman. You know, I support your efforts to keep this process moving, but I'm hearing concerns apparently on our side about the reach of amendments numbers 79 and 82 and some potential labor concerns. I'm not exactly sure what it is. Apparently, the Resources Committee has got some, these are forestry issues. So my question is the gentleman willing to work with us on this in this regard? I'm not even sure exactly what the concerns are.
Will the gentleman yield?
I will yield.
I would say to the ranking member, of course, I will work with and cooperate with the ranking member and the minority. We have accomplished so much together in that spirit. I'd be happy to continue to on those particular issues of concern.
Yeah, I'm not even sure what the concern is,
but we'll figure it out.
Work it out. So I think we've notified members that this is going on, but nobody has shown up. So are you prepared to yield back?
If you'll yield, but once again to me, just offer the observation that this en bloc amendment will move us substantially towards completion. I believe we'll continue work longer this evening, but most assuredly, I think we now, and the ranking member and I would agree, it's possible to meet our departure deadline tomorrow. Thank goodness. And with that, I yield back the remainder of my time on this en bloc amendment issue.
Yields back. The question is on the amendments in bloc offered by the gentleman from Oklahoma and the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Peterson. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The en bloc amendments are agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 51, printed in Part B of House Report 113-117. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Part B, amendment number 51, printed in House Report number 113-117, offered by Mr. Benishek of Michigan.
Pursuant to House Resolution 271, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Benishek, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan.
I'd like to thank the chairman for the opportunity to speak on this amendment and to bring this issue to the floor. As many of my constituents and colleagues know, I'm a doctor, not a farmer. So like they taught me in medical school, when you don't understand something or you need a second opinion, you ask the experts. Since becoming a member of Congress in January of 2011, I began talking to farmers in my district when I needed to learn more about agricultural issues. In fact, as I realized how much farming and agribusiness contributed not only to my district, but to Michigan's economy, I asked to join the Ag Committee so I could better represent them in Congress. Earlier this spring, I began to hear about a regulation that some of the farmers in my district were really concerned about. Now, if you don't have farmers in your district, let me tell you something, they will make sure that you know if there's an issue. Gradually, they began to talk to me more and more about a rule that had been proposed by the FDA that would make farming fruits and vegetables, better known as specialty crops, much more difficult in the near future. This rule, better known as the standards for the growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of produce for human consumption, was proposed by the FDA as a result of the 2011 Food Safety Modernization Act. Now, before I go any further, I want to make one thing crystal clear, and that I support access to clean, safe, and healthy food. But these proposed rulemaking will have widespread consequences for American family farmers. For example, farmers will have to comply with a new set of rules as determined by the FDA when cleaning and storing their equipment, meaning tractors, harvesters, knives, etc., so that domesticated animals may be prevented from contaminating them. In addition, the same rules suggest that farmers inspect each individual piece of fruit or vegetable for bird excreta and refuse to harvest it if they find any evidence. Mr. Speaker, I don't know if you've ever seen a cherry harvester or picked an apple. If you had to hand inspect each individual piece of fruit for bird feces and throw it out before sending it to a packer, well, let's just say that most of our growers would go to a pick-it-yourself system or simply stop growing. Let's move on to some other aspects of this rule. The FDA suggests continuous soil and water monitoring. While that might not sound like much or sound like a bad idea, we've already heard that some growers will have to completely redesign their irrigation systems to meet the new set of standards. I spent the last few years visiting with farmers in my district. I know that they want to provide clean, safe foods for the American public. All specialty crop growers I have met, eat the foods that they grow. So my point is, if the FDA estimates that this rule will cost, at a minimum, $460 million to the industry, why not make sure we're doing this right? My amendment simply asks that the Secretary of HHS delay implementation of any final regulations resulting from the Food Safety Modernization Act until a scientific and economic analysis of the rule can be completed. This analysis will focus on both the science behind and the economic impact of these regulations. In particular, this study will look at the regional differences in agriculture production to see how producers will be impacted by these rules. If we take the time to study the proposed rules, I think the FDA will be able to see that some changes may be in order. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and reserve the remainder of my time.
Gentleman reserves. What purpose does the gentlewoman from Connecticut rise?
Mr. Speaker, I rise to claim the time in opposition to this amendment and yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentlewoman's recognized.
I think it's very interesting that the Food Safety and Modernization Act was passed by the Energy and Commerce Committee, which has jurisdiction, as well as the FDA, and quite frankly, it does not have any jurisdiction under this piece of legislation, and quite frankly, I'm disappointed that it made it through the Rules Committee. However, in January 2011, the President signed a transformative food safety law that Congress had passed in a bipartisan manner to improve the health of our constituents. The legislation was supported by a broad coalition of consumer, public health, and industry groups, including the Grocery Manufacturers Association and the National Restaurant Association. When we crafted the final food safety bill, we struck a compromise on the scope of the bill so that the vast majority of truly small farms and processors are excluded, including those that sell most of their food directly to the public through farmers markets and farm stands, in addition to which regional considerations were also taken into consideration. The integrity of that compromise has been maintained in the proposals released by the FDA to date. I can speak to this compromise and the agreement we reached at the time because, in fact, I helped to craft and negotiate the final language. The law also requires that the FDA take regional differences into account when crafting its proposed rules. Let us be clear, that legislation was needed. Foodborne illness remains a threat to the public health. According to the Centers for Disease Control, each year 48 million Americans become sick from the very food they eat, 128,000 are hospitalized, and 3,000 die. These figures are far too high and simply unacceptable. So we acted. We passed the first major improvement to the FDA's food safety laws in more than 70 years. Under the guise of seeking a report, this amendment seeks to further slow down the implementation of the law, a law with the potential to improve the very health of our constituents by reducing their risk of becoming sick from food. Yet nowhere in the text of this amendment or in the intent of these reports do I see a mention of the public health or consumer safety. All of the FDA's proposals to implement this critical law already go through the official rulemaking process, meaning that the agency must consider the cost and the benefit of the rules, and that every one of us and our constituents can weigh in and submit comments on the rules already. The amendment before us now simply intends to slow down the process of implementing the law. Rather than working to obstruct and delay implementation, we should be working to encourage strong implementation. Let's look at what has happened since the bill was signed into law. In that short period of time, there have been almost 20 multi-state outbreaks positively linked to food products regulated by the FDA. One of those was an outbreak of listeria associated with cantaloupe, a product that had not previously been identified as associated with that dangerous pathogen. The same outbreak killed 33 Americans, the largest number of Americans lost to a single outbreak in a quarter of a century. Right now there is a multi-state outbreak of hepatitis A that may have been caused by a contaminated product regulated by the FDA. More than 115 people in 8 states have become ill, and more than 50 of them have required hospitalization. It continues to be supported by the majority of Americans. A recent poll showing that more than 75% of Americans surveyed supported the food safety law, which is why so many respected organizations that work to improve the public health, including the Consumer Federation of America, Center for the Science in the Public Interest, Pew Charitable Trust, Consumers Union, oppose this amendment. I urge my colleagues to heed their advice and oppose this amendment. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves. What purpose does the gentleman